This is the second lecture for Friday, April 3rd. We're going to be talking about succession, at least for 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes. So, communities change over time. And that we had this discussion of whether the typical cycle that communities go through is reaching an end, having some kind of dominant species, and that's the typical type of community that you find when they reach their pinnacle, or whether the more characteristic cycle that communities go through is that there's a disturbance, the communities develop over time, there's another disturbance, they can develop over time, another disturbance and recovery from disturbance is the norm. Either way, though, communities change over time. And this change that takes place in a number of different locations on land and in the water it occurs in a very predictable way in terms of which species are found when, in a very predictable way in terms of how long it takes for these changes to take place. But communities aren't static for very long periods of time. Sometimes, maybe it's hundreds of years, that this community remains relatively unchanged. But the environment tends to change. There's environmental changes that take place, and organisms are affected by these environmental changes. They have to respond to these environmental changes. Some responses are long-term, thousands of years, millions of years on an evolutionary basis. But the members of a community change over time as the environmental conditions in that community change. And that change, that repeatable and predictable change, is succession, ecological succession. So we're going to look at two different types. You might have some brand new habitat that's formed. Lava flowed into the ocean, so now you've got part of an island. Or there was a landslide that wiped out everything. Now you've got a bunch of soil and nothing lives there. Or you have a rock slide or something. There's a number of different situations where brand new habitat is created. More typically, though, that was primary succession. More typically, though, you've got some kind of a reset. You don't have a complete destruction of all the living things that were in a community, but you've got a big change, a big disturbance to a community, and then it starts this procession of this type of species and then that type of species, and then so you have succession from some starting point, not from zero, but from some starting point, that secondary succession. So let's look at these two. How do you have brand new habitat? Basically, there's nothing there, nothing that lives there. You have some new soil or new dirt. It's not soil since you don't have necessarily organic matter. Or a new pond, a new stream, a new river, something. There's some kind of new habitat. Sometimes it's an area that was destroyed by humans. But one way or the other, you've got some brand new habitat, and now things can start living there. You're going to have this progression of, first, there's not very many things that can live on bare rock, but some can. They can start, and then they set the stage for what comes after, and you have this succession of one type of species to another. So here's an example. You've got a lava flow, and there's lichen and there's moss that show up on this lava flow. They start to produce a little soil, this eroded rock and organic matter that's mixed together, and then you can have some plants starting to grow there. And then pretty soon you can see off in the background in this picture, you can have actual forests. You can have big trees that show up there. It's going to be many years until you get to the point where those type of trees can live there. On the other hand, you might have some habitat like you have a body of water, and that that lake or that pond gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And now you've got this sediment. You've got this soil, basically, sediment that transitions to soil, where it originally had a water, and now you've got soil. And so there's going to be a gradual change as that habitat becomes available. It's changed from an aquatic community to a terrestrial community. Both of those are going to go through succession. So primary succession happens sometime, but this secondary succession is what happens all the time, which people are really interested in. And so we'll look at primary succession to begin with, but really a lot of this has to do with secondary succession. To begin with, if you've got some bare rock, you're going to have the formation of soil, and you're going to have the pioneer species that show up to begin with. That's if there's nothing that's living there to begin with. So you have these pioneer species that are good at inhabiting those type of conditions. They don't need much. They just need a little niche to occupy, a little crevice in the rocks, some water, exposure to light and water, and they're fine. Lichens, mosses. That's what you find on land. Then, after these pioneer species show up, now you've got some things that need a little soil, they need some water, and so you have some early stage, you have grasses and you have weeds that show up, and then eventually then you have some shrubs and you have some small trees, and eventually, given enough time, you get to this climax community, and that can be established for a long time. It could be hundreds of years. Maybe there's fire that takes place and sets this back, not all with the way to zero, because you're not talking about bare rock anymore, but you're talking about some kind of reset where this process is going to take place over again. So to begin with, you've got some brand new habitat, and then you have these pioneer species that contribute a certain amount of soil, and then when there's soil there, that opens up opportunities for other things like grass and little plants, herbs, ferns, those kind of things. And now they're altering the ecosystem. They don't have much to grow in. They don't have very deep soil, so they're going to be relatively small plants. And these are type of life history traits that these species have. They're good at occupying some habitat when that opportunity opens up, but they don't persist for that long. And then eventually they're replaced by these mid-successional plant species. And so they need more soil. They need more stable conditions. They're not just going to grow in an inch of soil, but they're bigger grasses, bigger herbs, shrubs, or bushes. And they're not so great at inhabiting brand new habitat like the pioneer species or even the early successional species. They're not so weed-like, and yet they're not such great competitors as come along later. Because what you see later in these late successional stages are big things that need a lot of soil, stable conditions. They're very good at competing once they establish themselves, but they've got to have very different conditions than bare rock to be able to grow and be able to survive. These late successional plant species. And then ultimately, as long as conditions remain relatively stable, these late successional species are the climax community. So this is how succession basically ends until there's some disturbance that will start succession over again. Okay, well, that's a good place to stop. Then next Monday, we can finish up this idea of how communities change over time, or how succession takes place.